What can I say? It is such a pleasure to be here. I have not been to Dubuque before, but I want you to know I know a lot about Iowa post office murals. So I couldn't wait to come, and we're going to sneak over to the post office after later on this afternoon. It was a real pleasure when David called to say he'd heard that we'd done this show of work by African American artists, and was there any chance that we could extend the tour to Dubuque? Well, the show had toured, things had come back. The good news was we had not thrown away all the crates. So we started talking about what might work here. The show is probably, well, there's a lot of overlap between the initial show. But there was a lot of opportunity to bring in some new pieces. And one of the great pleasures of being a curator is, if you will, to look at the kids again, dress them in different costumes, stand them in a different order, and see what you see. And I have to say, every time I see a show of work from our collection in a different location, a place where another curator has done the installation, I always see things that I didn't know were there. And so I have to thank and congratulate Stacy for such a beautiful installation. It's been, yeah. It's been a pleasure to be here. I have all sorts of great new friends. Certainly, Stacy certainly, Margie Buell, David, wherever you are, David, Randy Langley, who is, I've learned more about Grant Wood in the last 24, 30 hours than I ever thought anybody knew. Jack Wurzberger, who's, I mean, you all have been incredibly wonderful hosts. Now, this is turned on, so let's go. This show, African American Art, extends from the Harlem Renaissance, basically, so from the early 1920s-ish, through the rest of the 20th century. It brings together painters, sculptors, and a couple of prints by people who, through their work and the subjects that they engaged, reflect dialogues that have been taking place throughout the 20th century about the rights of the individual, about who we are as Americans, and what it means to live in this great country. I mean, some of these conversations have been quite difficult, but they extend even now. In many instances, the work that these artists have brought to us offer us alternative histories from the ones most of us learned in school. We learned certain kinds of things, but we did not learn much about histories that deal with the internal migrations within the United States. We didn't deal a lot with literature that explores the implications of race and heritage and individual rights. Many of the earlier Harlem Renaissance artists, those who were working during the first 30 or so years of the 20th century, were profoundly influenced by the ideas of sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, by Langston Hughes, the wonderful poet, by the writings of Zora Neale Hurston, and others whose, a number of other literary figures, who in the 1920s and 1930s wrote materials that were not so much read by white audiences, but have now had a huge impact on black and white American culture. These years, this Harlem Renaissance period, was a time of exploration. It was also a time of affirmation. Probably the most influential book of that generation was Alain Locke's publication. It was called The New Negro, an Interpretation. It came out in 1925. It's not a read-through book, it's an anthology. It has poetry, it has images by Aaron Douglas and other artists, it has essays. Basically, it's an exploration from a number of different sort of social and intellectual and cultural views about what it means and what it might mean to be black in America. I mean, Locke was the perfect person to put it together. He was a philosophy professor at Howard University and taught there for years and years. Part of what he wanted to do was he wanted to bring together voices that talked about moving forward, not about looking back. He wanted to understand and wanted other people to understand how not to be a responsive, retrospective community, but how, in fact, to go beyond stereotypical images, stereotypical expectations in jobs and, all sorts of social situations. Now, the Harlem Renaissance came out of some very specific kinds of organizational structures. The NAACP was founded in 1909, and its publication, Crisis, actually in some ways was a model for what the New Negro book did, because it was a compendium of writings in a lot of different areas. Some of it was histories, politics, sociology, social action, poetry. The National Urban League was founded in 1910. It was another early civil rights movement. But there was a reason why these organizations were founded then. The questions of civil rights and civil liberty had been key aspects of American politics ever since the Civil War. Reconstruction had not done what it might have done politically or socially. So at the turn of the century, there really was a long way to go. Now, the piece of legislation and Supreme Court decision that guided so much of what really we in some ways are still dealing with today was an 1896 Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. It was the legislation was upheld in the Supreme Court in 1896, and what it did was it validated the idea of social segregation, racial segregation throughout the United States. So it essentially provided carte blanche for southern states to enact Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal legislation that we were still dealing with well into the 1960s. It still comes up in current conversation today. So it basically permitted discrimination in jobs, in education, housing, voting rights. You know, there have been some messing around with the polls in North Carolina this last election. Essentially all aspects of social and political life. Well, Jacob Lawrence, who was a youngish artist in the late 1930s, early 1940s, thought that, you know, he was an interesting guy. He lived in Harlem. He wasn't born there, but he grew up there, hung around artist studios there. And he said something about how, for him, as well as for almost everybody he knew, they had a sense of belonging in the South, because some member of their family had come there through the Great Migration, however. But some part of their family roots lay in the South. So he decided to take himself in the summer of 1941 to New Orleans. He was going to learn about the South and go to this place that he felt so much a part of. Well, it was a shock. I mean, he suddenly found himself living in a Jim Crow state where he had to ride in the back of a bus. He had to live in racially segregated housing. Precisely the kinds of things that Plessy versus Ferguson decision allowed. Well, this is a painting. Unfortunately, we could not include it in the show because it had too much light exposure. It's gouache on paper. But I wanted to show you this because this is one of the paintings that he did that summer in 1941 when he went to New Orleans. It's called Bar and Grill, and you can see pretty clearly what's going on here. On the left, well, the bartender is standing there reading his newspapers, and we're standing essentially behind him. On the left, that part of the bar is white patrons. There's a wall down the middle. Yep, there's our wall down the middle, floor to ceiling. It's got, it's got cracks in it, so it's not a solid wall. And the black patrons are on the right side. Two separate worlds, two separate environments. And remember, this is the summer in New Orleans. Notice who has the ceiling fan. There wasn't air conditioning in those days, so there was a benefit. One thing I will say about Jacob Lawrence, though, is that there is still sort of an ironic note about people who are drinking in the middle of the day. You know, you look outside and it's daylight outside. That is something that happens no matter which side of the bar. Now, the South was a complex and conflicted place for African Americans in the 19-teens and 20s. And thousands of people moved north to take jobs. And Chicago was a big destination to take jobs in industrial areas. Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, a lot. Their black populations exploded during this roughly 20 or so years that they called the Great Migration. The movement stopped really, or slowed way down by the 1930s with the Great Depression because the jobs just weren't there. But there were many tenant farmers and sharecroppers who still worked on the plantations where their parents and grandparents had been enslaved. Ellis Wilson, who is an artist whose name I'm fairly certain you won't know, but who did these incredibly wonderful paintings, had real empathy for those who stayed behind. He met Alain Locke, the Harlem Renaissance guy, when Locke came to Chicago to do a lecture in 1927. It turns out to have been a very momentous lecture and experience. There was something called the Negro in Art Week that was a celebration of black art, literature, culture, dance. Anyway, Locke came to do some talks, and he was very interested in meeting artists who, many of them were at the Art Institute of Chicago. They welcomed black artists with open arms when a lot of other art schools would not permit African Americans to enter. Anyway, Wilson was so inspired after meeting Locke and hearing him talk. He said he was going to switch what he had in mind to do, and he wanted to start doing art that was a credit to his race. Those are his words. So he started a whole series of genre paintings that show black workers. And in 1944, finally, he was able to go south on a Guggenheim Fellowship. This painting, I hope you can see it well enough without the glare. He did this painting as a result of that trip. It shows a family walking along a rough dirt path. You can see that they're all barefoot. It's hard work. Those are tobacco plants, which I don't know if you grow tobacco in this part of the world, but in the South certainly. Anybody would have recognized those and the little flowers on tops as tobacco plants. The plants tower over their heads. And you know that the whole family is working. I mean, the mother, the father, the sister, the brother, and then the little girl who is carrying their baby. Everybody is part of this work things. But as you look at this, there is an incredible dignity to the way they move through space. Their backs are straight. They look forward. Their shoulders are not bowed. We understand that this is a picture that is fundamentally a picture of dignity. And Wilson thought of hope. He said that he found so much hope in the South that I think was something that surprised him. Hope that people actually could go to school one day. Hope that people could vote one day. So, I mean, just those words tell us something about how far there was to go from the 1940s, late 1940s. This is actually done after World War II is over. So one would think we had made more progress by then. Claude Clark did a painting that you see here. It's called Resting. He said he was really more interested in people as types than as individuals, so he doesn't really give us much in the way of specifics about who this guy is who's sitting there. And so instead he focuses on scenes that express states of being. It's as though we're sitting here on the ground in front of this man having a conversation. The way he's positioned within the frame, he's maybe even a little uphill from us as we sit on the ground across from our friend, our colleague. We don't know anything about him except that he has on a red hat. We really can't see his eyes. They're covered by the hat. But he seems to be listening to what we have to say. I mean, it's an engaged conversation. Clark had been born in Georgia. He knew this scene. His father was a tenant farmer. But in the 1920s, the family had moved north as part of the Great Migration. Well, Clark, who also knew Alain Locke and Langston Hughes, believed that his work could serve as a catalyst for social change. So on one hand, you look at some of these things and you don't see a direct statement of activism. What Clark and a number of his contemporaries, I think, were doing was they were trying to resituate the image of the African American beyond the stereotypical kinds of things that showed up in ads, Aunt Jemima and all that sort of stuff, and move them into images where people are dignified, they're doing productive labor, they're relaxing on the ground, so that there is an element of sort of activist social justice just in the idea of reconfiguring the way we perceive people to look and be. This is one of Stacy's favorite pieces in the show. Richmond Barone, the sculptor who made this piece, it's called Blackberry Woman, ended up going to the Art Institute of Chicago because the New Orleans Art School, he was from New Orleans, refused to let him in. So he too was in Chicago during the Negro and Art Week in 1927, and he also met Alain Locke. Locke said, you know, you got to get out of here. You have to go to Harlem. That's where you're going to flourish. That's where you're going to find people who are your artistic and intellectual soulmates, people who were thinking the same kinds of things that you are. And it was the perfect solution for Barone. He got there, he met Aaron Douglas, who was probably the original visual artist of the Harlem Renaissance. He met the poet Langston Hughes, he met Wallace Thurman, who was a writer. And they brought him into their discussions, this young man, they brought and included totally in their discussions about what Africa meant, what life meant in urban versus rural America for African Americans. Well, Barone certainly saw African American women balancing baskets on their heads during market day while he was growing up in Bay St. Louis in Mississippi. So as he sculpted Blackberry Woman, he is honoring them, these women who carry the baskets on their head. But he is also making a link with West African sculpture. This very columnar form, this very frontal, very linear presentation of the sculpture is very much akin to sculpture from West Africa. But there's also a bit of a subtext here. The title is Blackberry Woman. Well, Barone took the title from a book by Wallace Thurman, somebody that he had met in Harlem, that was called The Blacker the Berry, a novel of Negro life. It was a tough novel because it dealt with discrimination within the black community and with skin color as being one of the determining factors that, that gave rise to perceptions of equality or not within the black community. Speaking of anonymous, Denny Andrews was part of the civil rights generation, not really the original Harlem Renaissance generation. But his father was a Georgia sharecropper, and sometime you may come across paintings by George Andrews. That was his father. He was a self-taught artist who has actually some presence in the American art world. Anyway, Benny served in the military after he, and he went to art school, and his father being an artist was a very encouraging thing for him to go to art school. And by the late 50s, he had moved to New York. So he started thinking about civil rights, as was very much on everybody's mind then. And in the 1960s, he became particularly involved in thinking about how he could productively be an activist. So he took a leadership role in something called the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, a number of other activist organizations that were designed to make sure that black artists had equal opportunities with white artists, none of whom really had great opportunities at that point. But about this time, he started a series of memory paintings based on his childhood in Georgia. This painting, it's called The Long Rose, is distinctly autobiographical, but it's also very universal. You know, we of course don't know anything about who this person is. We can't see her face. Her clothes don't give us any clues. But we do see this beautiful curved shape to her body and understand the toll that this physical labor of hoeing cotton takes. Andrews has made her a towering figure. I mean, she is, even though it's not a large painting, I mean, she sort of looms above us as we stand and look at the canvas. She's kind of an every woman. I mean, she represents stoicism, she represents heroicism, of people who actually do this work and continue to do it day after day. I like to think that the low vantage point is one way, of course, to heroicize the figure, but the other is that it's as though we're her child, hoeing along behind her, the way Benny hoed along behind his parents as they were chopping cotton. So that this is, as I say, autobiographical and with an emotional content, an emotional level of commitment that we often don't see in paintings from this period. Well, Denny was such a success. He was a success with his paintings. The paintings are powerful. He was became a force to be reckoned with in the sort of the activist, political, and social universe. And in the late 70s, in fact, he was tapped to head up the visual arts program at the National Endowment for the Arts. So this is one of, the top 3 visual arts programs, positions in the country. It was quite an honor. What was even better from his perspective is that it gave him a platform so that he could basically establish guidelines, not solely, but he could provide the leadership for establishing guidelines that allowed the endowments to do grants to artists outside of New York, outside of the mainstream marketplace. And so he did a huge, huge amount. Now, I wanted to show you a couple of urban images. This is Alan Rowan Kreitz, Sunlight and Shadow. I mean, it's essentially a documentary kind of a picture. But that's the way Creit decided that he could combat stereotypes. It really troubled him that the images of African Americans in the media, in ads, cereal boxes, all sorts of other kinds of product were distorted, and he believed demeaning. So he began what he called the Neighborhood Series. He said his intention in the Neighborhood Series was to show life in the city and, quotes, to present black people in an ordinary light, persons enjoying the usual pleasures of life with its mixtures of both joys and sorrows. He said, I was an artist reporter, recording what I saw. So in this case, he was chronicling, quotidian moments in the daily life in Roxbury, which is a predominantly African-American area of Boston. And he painted there throughout the 1930s and 40s. He painted children playing, he painted families going to church, friendly neighbors chatting in public spaces. This one I particularly like because it shows 3 generations. We have the young, sorry, wrong button. It shows an older woman here, the younger mothers, and the children who are not quite teenagers or even younger, all interacting with each other in what is about as normal a situation as we can ever hope to see in a public park. They are specifically gathered in Madison Park in the south end of Boston. So the image is specific and it's local, but it is also universal. It's about community, it's about stability, it's about family, and the interaction of people without there having to be a big deal. Now, Beaufort Delaney had another not quite so pleasant urban experience when he first came to New York. He came from Boston in 1929, and so the story goes, he was so excited he was coming to New York, he was going to go to Harlem, he was going to meet all sorts of exciting people, and somebody told him about a boarding house. So he went to the boarding house, he paid a month's rent, dropped off all his stuff, and then went out to explore the city, but he didn't get a receipt. And so he went back, the landlady said, who are you? You never paid me any money, I've never seen you before. So he was literally out on the street that night. Now, this painting comes from that experience. It could have been an angry painting about, being betrayed, about being ripped off, but it isn't. It's a picture of homeless men standing around a fire in a can, a trash can, on a cold night in the city. I mean, it's a spectacularly beautiful canvas, just beautiful. He's, this guy is a master modernist. He used to go to jazz clubs with Stuart Davis, who was famous and infamous for his experiences and painting jazz, really through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was a good friend of Georgia O'Keeffe's. He was James Baldwin, the novelist, was a friend. Playwright Henry Miller was a friend. And they all used to go, hang out and go to jazz clubs. Anyway, Campfire in the Park is, I think, one of the most glorious paintings in the show, because it is so filled with light and the camaraderie of these people together. Now, one of the questions that black artists have dealt with throughout the 20th century is what the heritage of Africa means for them, individually and collectively. And how do you reconcile the notion of Africa with the experience of being African American? For poet Langston Hughes, the connection was inescapable. He wrote a poem called I've Known Rivers that was published in Crisis in 1921. It's short, so I'll read it to you because there's no way to paraphrase and have the same kind of sense of what he's saying. He says, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all gold in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Gives you a sense of almost atavism, constancy, ancient power. Well, Sergeant Johnson, who was working in California, by the way, not in Harlem, had read this, and he has an interesting background. He came from a mixed-race family. His father's ancestors had come from Sweden. His mother was part Cherokee and part African American. But he was the only one of his brothers and sisters who determined to live his life as an African American. The others decided to be recognized as Native or Caucasian, but not Sargent. He said he wanted his sculpture to show what he called the pure American Negro. So he made a series of masks. These are highly prized objects that are made around 1930 and a little beyond. Their dates are not always totally clear. But the masks have these stylized oval faces, generous lips, wide noses, that reflected what he called his desire to depict the natural beauty and dignity in that characteristic lip, that characteristic hair, bearing, and manner. In other words, what Sergeant Johnson was doing was he was taking features that had often been exaggerated for stereotypical imagery, and he's turning them around. He's turning them into objects of beauty. He's saying that this is beauty, that this is distinctly African-based racial appearance is something that we should cherish and celebrate. And when you look at this piece, I think you can see, how carefully he's worked through, including in the hair. This is hammered copper, so it is a meticulously and very carefully worked piece. Lois Mailou Jones is an artist who taught at Howard University for more than 40 years. Someone I knew pretty well, really after she retired from Howard. She talked a lot about her identity as a painter. Part of it's because it's something that she had just been thinking about since she was a kid. From high school she went to the School of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, so she had really high-end academic training. And in high school she'd done research on the art of Africa as some school project. In this picture, it is a self-portrait. She's claiming her identity as an artist. You can see that she's got the brushes. You see the easel, you see the brushes. It's the basic confirmation of a normal self-portrait. But notice behind her, there are a couple of sculptures that are traditional West and Central African sculptures. She said she'd been thinking about Africa her whole life. And what I found really fascinating was that, I guess I knew her, she was close to 80 by the time I first met her and got to know her. And she said, one of the things that I've realized is I love Africa, I love the art of Africa, but I'm not African. I'm also not American. I'm something different. I am a fusion. I am an African American. And that is something that is very distinct and beautiful, which I was fascinated to hear her say, because this came from a lifetime of working through who she believed she was, who she understood herself to be. She was 65 when she finally went to Africa for the first time. The State Department invited her to tour a number of African countries, teaching and doing lectures as part of a cultural exchange program. So she goes to Africa 30 years after she paints the self-portrait. The trip dramatically altered her art. She'd been doing landscapes, still lifes, some sort of impressionist surface, beautifully painted but impressionistically painted pieces. And instead she started doing these images that are flat. The color is very flat, unmodulated. Often the palettes have come from kente cloth. So what she was doing, in part, was celebrating America's origins, African America's origins in the African continent and African folkways. And so at the center of this painting is a papier-mâché mask that's a replica of a white Kwale mask from Zaire. Above and below are stylized designs that are drawn from Ethiopian textiles. And they're profiles to either side of the mask that particularly because you see the eyes so clearly, it emphasizes these golden tears that are coming from the face of the mask. I asked Lois once, and she never specifically said what the tears were about. But she did say that the mask represents heritage and tradition. So at this point, as she's painting this, making this, and doing her tour of Africa, there are a number of African countries that were trying to throw off their colonial owners, the people who had run those countries for years and years and years. Which takes me to this painting by Emilio Cruz, another artist whose name is probably not familiar, but did incredibly powerful work. The notion of the sort of elusive emotional experience is part of what prompted Emilio to do this painting. The title is Angola's Dreams Grasp Fingertips. He said the title came from the sympathy that he felt for what he said was the freedom struggle that existed for many years in the country of Angola. He met two Angolan freedom fighters when he was in Rome. He was on a John Hay Whitney Fellowship and traveled around Europe and spent some time in Rome. And he said, these are his words, "These two bedraggled spirits were perhaps the most intense individuals I have ever met. Neither one could speak English, so we communicated in Spanish, mixed with Italian, perhaps at times assimilating Portuguese. Our souls touched, and I understood the life that blooms when people have dedicated their lives to what they believe to be a just cause." Now, Emilio never said why it took him 9 years from the time he met these freedom fighters to actually make this painting. What brought it up, when you check out the newspapers, it may have been, there were press reports of the ongoing war with Belgium. There were news that American countries had recently signed agreements to do oil exploration in Angola. But I think part of it may have been that between 64, when he was there, and 73, when he made the painting, he'd spent a little over a year in East St. Louis as an artist in residence. The purpose of the program was to bring art and with it a sense of possibility to the kids in the ghettos after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It was a very intense time for Emilio, and he came out, I think, doing a lot of work that had this very intense and very meaningful form. I mean, he did it in the shape of a mandala, just a Eastern spiritual form. And in some ways, I think is dealing a lot with the idea of opposites. There's a lot of energy swirling around in the center, but then there are lines. They're not tightly geometric lines, but they are lines of containment that contain the stability, the energy, that I think reflects what he believed, and that is that no matter what is true in life, the opposite is also true. So think about that one for a minute, and it'll keep you going for a while. The other piece I wanted to show you that deals with with Africa specifically and the colonialism in Africa is this amazing sculpture by Melvin Edwards. It's called Tambo, and he did it in 1993. It's a memorial sculpture basically for Oliver Tambo, who was president of the African National Congress. We don't know Tambo's name quite, it doesn't have quite the familiar ring that Nelson Mandela's does, but the two of them were the moving forces in the African National Congress for 30 or 40 years. In fact, Tambo, well, the two of them turned it from a sort of a splintery group of, you know, disorganized, well-meaning, but disorganized factions into something that really was a powerful force. While Mandela was in prison for those 30 years, Tambo was in exile. And so he was a lot moving around Europe, raising money for the cause and bringing people together who could ultimately help the cause of the fight against apartheid. So they called on South Africa's populations to demonstrate, to engage in nonviolent forms of demonstration and defiance of apartheid laws. But after the massacre in Sharpsville, which in 1960, the ANC became truly militant. I mean, they could not sit by and have the sort of passive behaviors allow for the kind of destruction and violence that had happened in Sharpsville. So the ANC became militant, and then it was banned. Well, Edwards, in doing this memorial to Oliver Tambo, I mean, I find this piece incredibly amazing, because when you look at it, it's all found stuff. It's, you know, you can see wrenches. There's a sort of a steel cup sort of a thing that has wrenches in it. It has I-beams. It has a chain. There are a couple of things, I don't know exactly what they are. But here, there is a shovel and there is a spear. And I can't help but think, and the shape of this whole thing is convex, so it's like a shield that has, you know, that kind of a shape. It's all there. All this sort of residual memory, emblems of agriculture, which is the world that Tambo came out of, but it's also the world of war. It's all put aside, it's all sort of brought together on this shield form. But when you look at it, you realize that that spear is still very sharp, it's still very shiny, it's very polished. And even though it's there in that holder with the shovel, it's there if he needs it again. I mean, it's an acknowledgement that because when we think we've solved a lot of problems, it doesn't necessarily mean we put our tools away and go home, that there are still always things to do. Now, I wanted to run through a few dates. This is my history teacher lesson moment, if you don't mind, about civil rights legislation and Supreme Court justices, because the 1950s and into the 1960s were an incredibly, in some ways, scary time when you realized what happened and why it had to happen. 1954, you remember, was the landmark Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, in which, contrary to Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate was not, by definition, equal. And Thurgood Marshall, of course, later to become a Supreme Court justice himself, was the attorney who argued the case. In December of 1955, so a year and a little bit later, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. Now, what I've discovered is a lot of people misunderstand. They think that Rosa Parks got on the bus, sat in a seat in the whites only section, and wouldn't get up when she was told to. Not true. She sat in the colored section of the bus. The white section of the bus got filled up, and so the bus driver came back and told her to get up and give her seat in the colored section to this person. That's what she refused to do. So she was definitive about what she was doing, but she didn't go into this whole thing, which has become one of the landmark episodes in 20th century American history. She didn't go into it as a fight. She went into it as a woman who was exhausted at the end of a day of work and finally had had enough and took a stand. Anyway, believe it or not, in September 57, so not quite 2 years after Rosa didn't give up her seat, Congress passed a federal voting rights bill. It was the first federal civil rights legislation passed since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It was almost 100 years later before there was federal legislation there. Civil Rights Act of 1960 established federal inspection of voter representation and registration rolls. 1963, a major year because of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed almost exactly 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, finally outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So this 10-year period from 54 to 64 was probably the most disruptive and powerful civil rights legislative period that has ever taken place in our history. Now, so what do we see when we look at Norman Lewis's beautiful, beautiful painting? He was very prominent as an abstract expressionist. He was hanging out at the Cedar Bar with Jackson Pollock and Franz Klein and all those guys. I mean, they were certainly by the late 50s and certainly by 62, they were the top of the marketplace in New York. Life magazine did articles on them, one in 1949. Jackson Pollock is the greatest living American painter. So that is the context in which Norman Lewis is painting. Well, he said he didn't think that art could solve society's problems. But it was a question that he and a number of other artists were addressing. How do you deal with this? Romare Bearden, Hale Woodruff, Lewis, Belrath Hines, whose painting I'll show you about, they talked a lot. And in 1963, just a month, 2 months maybe, before the March on Washington, they got together in New York to try to figure out if there was something that they could or should be doing to help the civil rights cause. They talked about what they called racial art, which was dealing with issues, with African American issues in some sort of narrative, formal, protest way. Anyway, this is a conversation that went on then and continues today. And for Bearden, that conversation shifted his work. He gave up everything that he had been doing before and shifted into doing images of, sort of like genre images of black life. For Lewis, Evening Rendezvous, if you haven't looked at it closely yet, take a look, because it's a deeply troubling painting. You stand back and think, oh, what a beautiful canvas. You know, sort of soft, diffused color over the surface. But the abstract dabs of white that emerge from the gray-green twilight, all these forms down here, they're hooded Klansmen. You look and you see the triangular shape of the hood. The hot reds at the center, they're coming out of the bonfires. The blue smoke. This is not a scene you would want to pass late at night on a road through Alabama. So it's a cautionary painting. It's a reminder painting. Ultimately, yeah, maybe a protest painting. But one of the things that Lewis does with this is he mocks the notion of what red, white, and blue, which has been adopted by the Klan as their color, as their sort of symbolic colors. So as beautiful as this painting is as a purely abstract work, the more you look, the more sort of really terrified you feel about what it all means. This is several people's favorite piece. So I think it was certainly one of David's. It's one of mine. I was involved in and the museum's getting this, and it's one of my things that I'm most proud of out of all these years. It's by a guy named Thornton Dial, whom you may have known. I think Indianapolis did a major Thornton Dial show a number of years ago. Anyway, he was a self-taught artist who made paintings, sculptures, steel assemblages that deal often with challenging subjects: politics, racial equality, social justice. He was deeply engaged in contemporary issues. And, the question has always come up, so how do self-taught artists, folk artists, if you will, how do you negotiate where they are and what they do within the sort of the art world hierarchies? Well, my answer is I don't. This man has made such powerful art that I think we don't care how we categorize him. I don't know that that tells us much about who he is, except that this is somebody who found a way to express something that was very important to him. He had worked at a lot of different jobs throughout his career. He was a bricklayer, he was a welder, a house painter, and for 30 years he worked in a factory that made railroad boxcars, so there was the steel working part of it. So he brought skills from a lot of different trades to his art making. This is a piece, it's called Top of the Line, Steel, S-T-E-E-L in parentheses, is his response to the 1992 riots that shook Los Angeles after the jury found the white policeman not guilty of beating Rodney King. So it seems almost tepid, this scale, but when you go up and look at it in person, it is big. Pieces stick out from the wall about this far, so it, in a sense, invades your space. I mean, it's not quite sculptural, but it does. They're rope-lined figures. You can see a lot of these figures have ropes around their head. There's one over here where there's the way the rope loops, it makes it look almost like a noose. So it's not a judgmental painting. He's not saying you should not, this is horrible, this is evil. It's showing something that what is. He thought it was important for his art to help people negotiate the world. He said, and this is a quote that, do you care that he's self-taught, that he didn't know how to read particularly? He said, art is like a bright star up ahead that can lead people through the darkness and keep them from being afraid. That's about as profound. Now, I want to skip over, there are a number of ways that people have found affirmation. For Fred Brown, this is his image of John Henry. John Henry from the song. Remember that song? It's a legend that goes back over 100 years. For him, the idea of folklore is something that we can all bring to bear on who we are and what we care about now. Rene Stout invented a sea captain who sailed the world, collected objects that he brought back home to his lady love and to share with her. The sea captain was like his father, who brought things from the outside world home to her mother, who was very shy, really very shy. So this is another way that we find sustenance. Whitfield Lovell sensed the spirits in a house in Houston, an old row house in Houston, a place where railroad workers had lived. And they were all going to be torn down, so they turned it into an art project for a little while, and artists went in and did things on the wall. Well, he sort of conjured up from his imagination somebody who used to live there, and she brought sustenance to this place. They were going to tear the buildings down, so he cut the wall out. So what you see is actually the wall of that house upstairs. For Charles Searles, it was a street celebration in Philadelphia that had brought together musical instruments, African drummers, dancers, something that could engage the whole community. And Felrath Hines, I wanted to close on this because I think it's a really funny picture. I knew Fel. He was a conservator. He was a member of the Spiral, so he was an activist artist in New York around, 1963, the time of the of the March on Washington, but he disagreed with a lot of the other artists. He didn't think that art needed to have any sort of a racial component. He thought for him it had to be something totally independent of social issues. And yet, so there we have two paintings in the show. One is a 60s painting that's a beautiful abstract, it's almost like a landscape, but sort of abstract, very brushy forms, big painting. And then there's this, which, as I say, I think it's very funny. It's serious in the sense that he's playing with perception. So the way he's using, the greens and the reds and the yellows, but these little sort of oddly shaped windows. So it's as though he's made a triangular window that looks out behind, and yet the sides aren't even. Same thing here. It's like there's just a little bit askew about it. This is not a badly cropped slide. This is the way the painting is. The white border on the right is narrower than the one on the left. But for me, what's truly funny is this form here. It reminds me of my kid when I'd say, stand right there, don't move. He'd stick his toe right over the line, just to say, I'll do what I want to anyway. And that's what I find so wonderful about this painting, is that no matter what the rules or the structures or the geometries are, you can always find a little way to be yourself. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thoughts, answer any questions that I can. So, yes?
What was art like for you in high school?
I'm sorry?
What was art like for you when you were in high school?
When I was in high school, well, it was a little weird. I lived in Spain, so art for me was the Prado Museum. I didn't, beyond going to the Prado, or if we took a trip someplace, so I looked at all that stuff in the cathedrals and the painting that was really so incredibly fascinating, I didn't know what to do with, was the Hieronymus Bosch, the Garden of Earthly Delights. If that's one you've ever seen, I mean, when you're a 14-year-old, you just don't know what to do with that. But I didn't become an art historian until I was really later in my life. I met this very cute guy who had a paintings conservation business, and I was doing something entirely different. And so we started going to openings, and I started standing in the corner kind of listening and thought, you know what, this isn't any fun. So I went to the University of Maryland and took art history from the Renaissance to the present from 7 to 10 on Monday nights. And that was it. I quit my job and went back to school full time, and I've been doing it ever since, and I've never had a boring day. Not one, ever.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thoughts? Do you have favorite? Yes.
I'm a little haunted by sunrise and shadow, sunlight and shadow.
Sunlight and shadow?
Yeah, that woman on the bench.
Hang on, let me go back to it.
The woman on the bench looks like she's grieving, and that there's some consolation going on. And in today's newspaper photos, to me, that would be somebody that shot her son. It has that kind of a dramatic element that's totally understated. And none of the descriptors talk about her, or they just act like it's an average day. And in this day and age, for a Black community, that is an average day, I'm afraid. But I wondered if there was any thinking about what those people were thinking.
His facial expressions, Kreitz never does facial expressions that are terribly active. We have a second painting by him called School's Out that shows, mothers and children, mostly girls, having just at the end of the school day, and they're all out on the street sort of running along. Even though the body language feels fairly light, the kids are skipping along, their faces are still very, almost stoic, very expressionless. So, I don't know, I mean, he didn't ever talk about that. He really thought he was capturing capturing what he saw, but he also is romanticizing it to some degree. I mean, it's not, and this woman seems to be commiserating maybe with someone. The one I think of is the grandmother. I don't know. Those quiet moments when you remember something and it takes you back, and you're not where you are. You're in a different mental place. I don't know. But Crichton never, to my knowledge, he stopped doing these paintings not too long after this, and began doing religious paintings, illustrations for religious books, and the work is very beautiful, but it's really quite different from what he had been doing. Some of these things were done on the WPA. And, so.
Going back to that picture of the red, white, and blue on the canvas with the Klan, am I seeing it properly that it's kind of an outline of a pair of glasses?
Oh, you know, yeah,
Can you
this,
see
what
that
you're
in a
thinking of
sense?
is this kind of form here?
Yeah,
Yeah, you know, I don't know.
it's an abstract. I'm just curious if that's...
Yeah, and there is a lot, if you Google Norman Lewis, you will see a lot of his paintings have come up in the marketplace and are in museum collections. And you'll see that he uses these same sort of, it's like a notation, you know, musical notation, but it's a visual notation that he's using. And you know, I don't know, as people sort of spill out across this field, whether they're just denser at the bottom because that's where the cars would have been parked, I don't know, and then they sort of spread out as they deal with the fire. I don't know.
I see that as the shape of the United States.
I said the same thing. Looks like an
Oh my
outline of the
gosh.
United States, exactly.
Come look at this.
I see Texas down there where you're
Yeah.
born.
A lot of folks over there in the south and in Texas, right?
Same thing.
That's an interesting. That's a very interesting observation.
This is another perfect example. You can't capture art on a screen or on a slide because the Thornton Dial is totally lost on the screen.
Yeah.
There's no way you can capture that.
So the good news is
Even
it's
slight
just a,
bit on the
it's
on
just
the
a
screen.
stairway away.
Yeah.
I don't know, I love that the Dubuque Museum of Art wanted to bring these things here, and that you all came to see them. If they were not here, they would probably be in storage in Largo, Maryland, and that's not good enough. They need to be in the world where they speak to people. So, I don't know, we're going to see if we can't cook up more possibilities into the future. If there are no other questions, class dismissed.